granniopteryx, she knows the truth, she's linking every link.
Hello. I know it might seem like a bit of a stretch to quote the Jason Arday scandal and the appointment of Farah Ahmed to the Education Department of Cambridge University as prime examples of why socialism fails, but I do hope that by the time I've said, until next time, you'll be convinced. So let's start with the basics. How did our universities get to this state of corruption and waste? Well, it all really started with Tony Blair and the Fabian idea that you can engineer society to make it work better. And once it's been engineered to work better, it will stay like that for all eternity. So let's get back to the beginning of this second wave of the British socialist experiment. The first wave was in the 60s and 70s, when the Labour governments found themselves at the mercy of the unions. And that's because the British Labour Party had been proceeding with a sort of soft version of the collectivism of the Soviet Union, which couldn't possibly work in Britain because, as anyone with any sense should know, collectivism was impossible to achieve without Soviet-style enforcement. Well, it didn't work, and Margaret Thatcher stopped all of that briefly, but the rest of the Conservative Party weren't prepared to commit to her vision. They pushed her out and then tried the same soft communism as before, with similar results. Actually, this is the one thing I'm worried about, that it might happen in the USA after Trump. But perhaps we'll talk about that another time. So, over here, when the Conservatives ran out of steam, Tony Blair took over and started the whole socialist engineering programme again, with his idea of a brave new world of new Labour and cool Britannia, and a hideous wardrobe of weird velvet suits. And not long afterwards, all of that turned out to be just like these Soviet cog designs you can see here at the side of the screen. Outdated and inefficient. Look, in the early 20th century, the steel cog was the symbol of modern tech, and it looked to the people of the time all smart and the future. That is, until we got plastic and transistors. Then all those coggy designs just looked like a Charlie Chaplin film. And so with Tony Blair's vision of Britain. And I'm afraid with this present Labour government as well. Burnham's talking about redesigning the country, isn't he? There's something about socialists. They believe they can change us by resetting the country to whatever the cog version is at the time. The Soviet cog version of the world took about 40 years to start going out of date, and then another 30 slowly to grind to a halt. But things aren't like that now. The pace of change has increased. There's no slow change anymore. Vacuum tubes were replaced by transistors, which gave way to integrated circuits on silicon chips, which with each generation crammed more and more and more information into smaller and smaller spaces, and each development took less and less time. Tony Blair's cog version was the idea that almost everyone would go to university, which would socially engineer British society. The fact that it kept young people out of the job market for a while was also another bonus, as it helped to disguise the problems of our failing industries. But it turned out to be an outdated idea within just a few years of it starting up. So, before AI, universities were a centre of education because that's where all the books were and that's where the discussions were. Now the books are everywhere and the discussions are on X or Blue Sky if you're a complete mad person. Anyway, universities, the way Tony Blair envisaged them, are becoming redundant. Of course, there will always be the STEM stuff and some rather esoteric subjects. But apart from that, yeah, they are going out of fashion, just like those cogs. They're not entirely gone just yet, and that's the problem. We're at what J.B. Priestley called a dangerous corner. Or even better, like what happens when a rat is run into a corner. It becomes more dangerous. As universities steadily lose influence, and particularly they're losing cachet, they're desperately scrabbling around for ways to make themselves more relevant, and they're doing that by coming up with more and more outlandish areas of research, which they try to make, well, sound scientific by piling up mountains of jargon. And they're encouraged to do this because they have to feed their bureaucracy. Some of you might have read Cecil Northcote Parkinson, and those of you who haven't, I do suggest you do. I'm sure all this stuff is online now. A good example of why a university is not that important anymore. But if you haven't read Northcote Parkinson's work, he wrote a lot about what he called bureaucratic bloat. He said that the number of people in an administrative organisation tends to grow continuously. He put the figure at about 5 to 7% every year, that the bureaucracy is going to just creep outwards. And he said this was regardless of whether the actual volume of work increases or whether it decreases or even if it just stays the same. And he illustrated, remember, he was writing, I think, mostly in the 50s and the early 60s. So he illustrated his point by talking about the Admiralty, the driver of the Navy. Between 1914 and 1928, he said, the number of capital ships, that is, dreadnoughts, battleships, the fighting stuff, they fell from 62 to 20. And the number of fighting officers and men declined as well. Yet the number of Admiralty non-military officials rose by around 78%. So, back to the universities. If universities were run on the old capitalistic model, what would happen is that extras would be cast off as unprofitable. But when an organisation is publicly funded, like the Admiralty for instance, or the BBC, it just sucks in more assistance. In other words, there's no external control and so no adjustment to changing circumstances. And we have no more striking example of this bureaucratic bloat than our universities here in the UK. Figures for King's College in London show that by 2024, which is sort of fairly recent, but not right up to date, non-academic staff had grown by around 22%. Academic staff, it had grown by only 5%. Which meant that as of 2024, non-academic staff actually outnumbered academic staff in King's College. And that was inevitable. What was also inevitable was that the academics would they'd start to serve the bureaucracies instead of the other way round. That's what's going on. And that's how Jason Arday managed to do what he did. because the department didn't want research. They wanted a star, because a star attracts funds, and bureaucrats have a bottomless appetite for funds. And that's why an assistant research professor called Farah Ahmed, the same one I started talking about at the beginning of this video, Farah Ahmed is on record as saying that Western education is a threat to Islam and is designed only to turn out a generation of model Western citizens, which you might think would be a cause of celebration for anyone living in this country and expecting a British education, but not for her. And she is being celebrated by Cambridge. And she is also now in a position to influence the training of teachers throughout the United Kingdom. Look, I don't know the lady, and I've read very little of her work, and she might have educational qualifications of which I am unaware. But my guess is that one of the factors in her employment in Cambridge is because her presence there will attract foreign investment. And for foreign, I mean Middle Eastern. And for Middle Eastern, I mean Qatar. Which investment will help fund the increasingly bloated bureaucracy. And even worse, as well as bloated, as with any bureaucracy, it's an ossified bureaucracy, in which the only change possible is the employment of more and more cogs in the wheels. And that brings me back to those Soviet cogs there. Just like those cogs, universities are steadily becoming less and less relevant because AI is taking over, and the system, as set up by the Blair government, can't compete. Now, if universities had been kept elitist, free, and relatively small, then they would have survived this present typhoon of online knowledge. But pretty soon, there's going to be a crash in education that is going to make the stock market crash of the 1920s look like a minor blip. I mean, how many of you would consider a place like Cambridge as a suitable educational establishment for your child or your grandchild? I mean, if your kids came to you and said, will you help fund little Oliver's university career? Where's he going? Oh, the education department of Cambridge University. What would you say? And what's happening now is that our universities are starting to look a lot like that bloke who turns up on a hiking trip with a huge backpack full of luggage that he doesn't need, and bent under the weight of the extra nice clothes, the full-size shampoo bottle, the towels, and the extra lanterns, the cans, and the coffee maker. He stumbles along looking more red in the face and more ridiculous, and losing ground and falling further behind, while everyone else strides ahead with an inflatable mat, a rain sheet, a headlamp, and a mobile phone. And that's it. All right, well, have I convinced you that universities are going the same way of those cogs and that Tony Blair is responsible for the whole thing? Well, let me know in the comments below, or at the side, or wherever they are on your browser. Till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.